Hi everyone, it's David Thompson again with Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines, joined today by Dr. Lisa Brady, who is the Associate Professor of History at Boise State University, as well as the author of War Upon the Land, Military Strategy and the Transformation of Southern Landscapes During the American Civil War, which is out with University of Georgia Press. So, Dr. Brady, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
If you wouldn't mind, could you just start us off with giving a little bit of a sense of the general arc of this book?
Sure. Well, the book is a study of how ideas of nature shaped Union strategy during the Civil War. And I start with a very broad overview. My first chapter, I'll recommend to your readers that if they don't want all of the definitions of things and that they can probably skip the first chapter. Even if I think it is integral to my argument, I think you get some of the issues throughout the rest of the book. But the first chapter is an overview of 19th century ideas of nature, focusing on how the concept of control really shaped the ways that Americans in all walks of life, in all regions of the United States, approached the natural world through engineering, through farming, through ideas of improvement, through an idea of hierarchy within the natural systems, with, of course, humans being on top. And so I take some of those ideas and then try to suggest through 4 case studies that these ideas of nature actually helped the Union officers, in particular U.S. Grant, Phil Sheridan, and William Sherman, to create strategies that either attempted to employ those ideas of nature, this idea that humans can control nature, or that they tried to upend that idea by taking away control of nature from their enemy. And those ideas are what helped the Union to win the war. So the first chapter that I look at that is really about an operation. I've got 4 operational case studies. Operations along the Mississippi River, where they used engineering to try to reroute the Mississippi on a number of occasions. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The second case study is the Siege of Vicksburg, where Grant really understands that tipping this idea of control over nature on its head might be the best way to military success, where he essentially begins these small raiding parties and living off the land, even as he's engaging in a very traditional siege against the fortifications at Vicksburg. The third case study is one of Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, where you see this incredibly broad, sweeping introduction of the chevauchée. Others say that that was what Sherman did in Georgia and the Carolinas, but I would say that the real first exercise in this on a large scale was in the Shenandoah Valley under Sheridan. First David Hunter and then Sheridan. And the final case study is the culmination of this strategy with W.T. Sherman in Georgia and the Carolinas. And in the end, I suggest that with this notion of nature and how the Union strategists applied that to their military goals, you get this widespread destruction. And Americans responded to this destruction in a variety of ways, one of which includes the notion that we actually need to preserve those areas that we see as beautiful, as necessary. And so you start to see the beginnings of national parks right after the Civil War. And I, at the end of my book, suggest that that might be one of the explanations for why we have it, is this destruction of the war. Very long explanation.
It's quite all right. I was wondering, what inspired you to pursue this topic? It's obvious, it's quite interesting, and it's bringing together really 2 different threads here, in terms of studying the war itself, but also environmental history.
It is. And frankly, I'm glad you brought that up, because those 2 threads have been very removed from each other for so long in the historiography that's one of the reasons why I felt that first chapter was necessary, to introduce people from both sides of the approach that I'm taking to the concepts that each holds as part of their historiographical methodology. But that aside, my inspiration was a very brief conversation that I had in a graduate class. It was the 19th century colloquium with Philip Shaw Paladin. And just as a minor question, I asked him one day after class, I said, so Dr. Paladin, has anyone ever written on the environmental history of the Civil War? And if you are familiar with what he looked like, he was this tall, stately, very professorial man with a deep voice. And he said, "No, that's what you will do." So I did. I couldn't go against a professor at that time. I still am a little worried about that. I have a great deal of respect for him and for what he's done for the Civil War history. And so I thought, okay, here we go. So it was a brief conversation that got me started on this path, and he was incredibly supportive throughout the whole process, along with, of course, Donald Worster, who was my major advisor and the advisor on the environmental side of things.
Right. Now, you mentioned that there are 4 case studies here. Was there one that you loved, you could have written twice as much about that particular one, or is there one that really grabbed you more than the others? Is it possible?
Yeah,
to consider that?
My project started out that it was going to focus only on Sherman in Georgia and the Carolinas. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that in terms of the creation of strategy, while that was a unique departure, well, not unique, but an important departure or expansion of this larger strategy, where it all got started was the Mississippi River. And I think my interest in the river itself grew as an outcome of my research. And I was more struck by the ways that the soldiers who were grubbing in the mud, who were pulling trees out of the way, who were dealing with snakes falling all around them as they were trying to cut willows out of the streams that they were working along beside the river, that was what captured my attention more. And I think that the Mississippi River, in all of its twists and its turns and its sort of its own personality, as an environmental historian who looks at nature having historical agency, actually impacting the flow of history, the river itself was just both a metaphor and a reality that really got my interest going, I think. So that first case study chapter, I think, is my favorite.
And understandably so. And I think it's fascinating taking a look at the work, particularly when you discuss water and kind of looking at the mixed blessing that it provided.
Right.
At times, it's obviously vital to life, and then the efforts to, redirect the river, as you said, but also water can help breed disease.
Yes.
And it's just remarkable kind of looking at water from so many different angles.
Absolutely. And it is. I like how you put that, where water is the bringer of life, but in the South at this time, it was also a major harbinger of death because of yellow fever, because of malaria, because of other diseases, typhoid or typhus. I can't remember which one. Typhus, I believe, is the waterborne disease. But in any case, it really is. It's got that paradoxical role in our lives. It's necessary and yet slightly dangerous.
Right. Now, is there a case study that didn't make the cut? Is there one out there from the war that you think is fascinating, perhaps just time constraints or for any other reasons it just didn't make it in there?
Yeah, there isn't one. The book itself is sort of a complete whole, but okay. I think that the Siege of Atlanta certainly could be in here. I think much more could be done on the West, the Western Theater, Missouri, Kansas, those areas, especially Missouri, where you've got a lot of really thick undergrowth and forests areas. Matthew Stith, of course, has done some work on that. His dissertation that came out a couple of years ago. He's done some really interesting work on that with the irregular warfare. So I didn't come up with anything, but I'm really glad to see that others have and have started doing some research into those areas that I didn't even think about while writing this book.
And kind of building off of that, are there even some other directions in terms of environmental history in the war, things that you hope that is going to be pursued, or perhaps from firsthand knowledge some other individuals might be pursuing it? Where do you see kind of this field going, since it is an infant, really, in terms of these two areas joining one another? Where do you think this is going?
Well, it's I always hedge my bets a little bit in predicting things. I like to say I'm a historian. I look to the past, not the future. But if I could make requests as to the directions where Civil War environmental history might go, there are several areas. There's actually, I was asked to write an essay on this very topic, and it's on the Journal of the Civil War Era website. It's a forum that Stephen Barry moderated. And I pulled out 3 different areas: the origins, which people have not been looking at all. So the origins of the war, for example, the race to control the West. I mean, how did that shape landscapes? How did the political and social debates and ethical debates over slavery shape landscapes as well? I think there's a lot that can be done there. On the war itself, I think Matt Stitt's work on irregular war certainly is important, and War on the West needs to come out. I mean, these wonderful landscapes. I know that Megan Kate Nelson has done some work on New Mexico. Fascinating, fascinating work. I mean, a completely different environment, the desert Southwest compared to Virginia, and the way that war developed there. And she's done a really interesting job with that. Mobilization, I think, is where a lot of work has potential to be done. How did mobilizing cattle, not just for beef, but for shoes, to put shoes on the feet of so many millions of soldiers, how did that impact the landscapes in the West in particular? Because Kansas, Illinois, Indiana, all of those places were supplying the Union to support the war effort. What impacts did those have on the landscape? And the final one, I really could go on forever. There's so much to be done on this. But on Reconstruction, obviously, there's been nothing done. I know that Brian Drake at the University of Georgia has some ideas about doing some work on the North and Reconstruction. And Mark Hersey at the university, he's at Mississippi State University. He has just talked with me a little bit about a project he's working on the Black Belts, and how the end of the war shaped natural relationships as well as race relationships all across the Black Belt in the South. And I'm very eager to hear what he has to do with that.
Okay. Well, that seems to be a lot of different avenues of exploration there.
You asked for the future.
I did indeed, and I got a great answer in return. Now, speaking of your future, what are your future projects at the moment, or project that you're kind of putting your attention towards?
Well, I have taken just a little break from the Civil War, and I've turned my attention to the war in Korea, actually.
Okay. Wow.
But I just attended a workshop on GIS, Geographical Information Systems. And as I was sitting at this workshop, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to create a project, a web-based project, GIS-based project, where I could take the letters and the orders and all of the primary source documents that I used in my book and link them to the places where they were written from, where they were written about, connect them to photos from the time or even etchings from the time about the places they were written about, and create this really visually interesting exploration of this progression of the strategy that the Union used to finally win the war. So that's a pipe dream, perhaps, but I think that's where my imagination is really taking me at present, a GIS-based project on the book itself.
And that would be great. And certainly yet another way to try and convince a public that we do engage with technology, we do embrace it. We are not all we do study the past, but we don't necessarily live in the past, that we are willing to kind of embrace alternative methods of trying to reach a broader audience. And I think GIS is really a great way of doing that.
There are some great apps out there. In fact, ArcGIS, Esri, ESRI, has these things called story maps. And you can go, it's storymaps.esri.com. And they have one for the Civil War. And it's this fantastic map where you can do a time scan and it shows all the battles popping up here and there on the map. And it's a really neat way of visualizing the war.
Now, obviously, another hat, if you will, being a teacher and teaching. So when you do have the opportunity to teach about the Civil War, are there certain things that you like to impress upon your students about the war?
Yes, there are. I teach in a place that didn't have much of a local experience with the war. I mean, I'm in Idaho, and there was a wartime battle here in eastern Idaho, but it was between Union forces and the Native Americans, the Shoshone Bannock. So it often isn't known for being a Civil War battle. But in any case, there's still a lot of interest here. And quite a few of the settlers of Idaho actually came here after the war, looking for freedom, looking for just to get away from all of the problems back east that they saw happening. And so there's still some familial connections to the war. And so I've got to remind students to remember to look at the sources, to weigh all of the information, not just what you think that your family's past related to the war was. And so for me, it's really about getting them to seek that convergence of evidence. What do the majority of people who witnessed the event that they're studying have to say about it? And perhaps the biggest question, of course, and one of which my new colleague Ray Crone just discovered, was people talking about slavery as the origin of the war. Is it not? Is it states' rights? And so this idea of bringing the convergence of evidence, the statements of secession, the declarations of secession, Stephen's argument about the cornerstone speech, Lincoln's first inaugural address. What do all of these things bring to bear on that debate over the origins of the war? And what I have discovered, and I think what many Civil War historians have discovered, is that slavery is central. But there are still people who are debating that, and especially students. And I'm hoping that I can get them, even if not on that issue, but on a lot of different issues, to really go to the sources and think about those sources as their windows into the past, and how they can take information and meaning from those sources still today.
And finally, don't want to take up too much of your time. Is there a book that you might be recommending to our audience? We're always adding to the pile of books that we'll eventually get to. But I was wondering if you might have something to pass along that you've read recently that's really grabbed your attention.
Well, there are so many good books. I love Drew Gilpin's Faust's book, Mark Shant's book, which came out at the same time, Awaiting the Heavenly Country. It came out at just about the same time as Faust's book, and unfortunately was overshadowed. It's a fabulous book on the culture of death during the Civil War. Megan Kate Nelson's book, which I know you've already interviewed her, but it's just, she's such a brilliant thinker and a wonderful writer. But the one that I always go back to is Phil Paladin's Victims. It is such a beautifully written book. It's such a slim little volume that encapsulates everything about the war, really, in just such a small space. And I use it every time I teach my Civil War class. So, I know it's not one that you necessarily can interview about, but I still love that book, and I will recommend it to anyone who's interested in the Civil War.
It's a phenomenal read. I would heartily endorse it as well.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Brady, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time and speaking with us. Again, the book is War Upon the Land, now out with UGA Press. Highly recommend it. Great look at really a lesser-known facet of the war, but something that we all certainly need to recognize as being incredibly important to our understanding of the war and those that fought it and experienced it. So, Dr. Brady, again, thank you, and hope to have you on again at some point in the future.
I would be honored. Thank you so much for inviting me.